there lived a boy who would become a legend. His story begins not with gunfire or glory, but with the quiet struggles of an ordinary family, trying to make their way in a world that offered few guarantees and even fewer second chances. The America of the 1850s was a nation stretching its limbs, reaching toward the Pacific with an ambition that matched its growing pains. Cities rose from nothing, families packed their belongings into wagons, and children learned early that home wasn't always a place you could return to. In this restless landscape, a boy was born who would carry within himself both the promise and the tragedy of his generation. His name was Henry McCarty, though the world would know him by other names before his story ended. He came into existence on a cold November day in 1859 in the crowded neighborhoods of New York City, where immigrants and dreamers pressed together in tenements that reached toward a sky often hidden by smoke and fog. The exact date of his birth remains lost to history, like so many details of his early life. But what we do know is that he entered a world already marked by uncertainty. The tenements of Manhattan's Lower East Side held the dreams and struggles of thousands of families in the 1860s. Among them lived Catherine McCarty, a young Irish immigrant woman whose husband had died when their son Henry was still small enough to fit in the crook of her arm. The loss of a father in those days meant more than grief. It meant a family sliding toward the edge of survival in a city that showed little mercy to those who faltered. Catherine McCarty was a woman of quiet determination, the kind who rose before dawn to take in washing from families more fortunate than her own. Her hands, roughened by lye soap and cold water, worked methodically through piles of other people's linens, while her young son played in the corners of their one-room apartment. Henry learned early to make his own entertainment, fashioning toys from scraps of wood and string, developing the self-reliance that would define his short life. The boy who would become Billy the Kid spent his earliest years in the shadow of his mother's struggle. Catherine worked as a laundress, her days beginning before sunrise and ending long after the last customer had collected their cleaned clothes. The work was hard and poorly paid, but it kept them fed and housed, though barely. Henry watched his mother's quiet sacrifice with eyes that seemed older than his years, absorbing lessons about resilience and survival that no schoolroom could have taught him. When Henry was still very young, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, Catherine made the difficult decision to leave New York City. The opportunities there were too few, and the city's harsh rhythms offered little promise for a widow trying to raise a son alone. She had heard stories of the frontier, where land was cheap and a person could build something from nothing if they had the will to work for it. With their few possessions bundled into a worn carpet bag, mother and son began a journey that would carry them across a continent. Their first stop was Indiana, where Catherine had distant relatives who might offer help, or at least a place to rest while she looked for work. The journey itself was an education for young Henry, who pressed his face to train windows and watched America roll past in an endless parade of farms, forests, and small towns that looked exactly like the ones they had just left behind. Each mile carried them further from the cramped streets of New York toward something that felt like possibility, though neither mother nor son could have imagined where their travels would eventually lead. Indiana in the 1860s was still finding its identity between the established East and the Wild West. The small towns they passed through had main streets lined with wooden storefronts, churches with simple steeples, and schools where children learned their letters on slates that had to be carefully preserved. Catherine found work where she could, sometimes washing clothes, sometimes cooking in boarding houses, always moving when better opportunities beckoned from the next town over. Henry's childhood in Indiana was marked by the constant motion of a family seeking stability, but never quite finding it. He attended school sporadically, when they stayed in one place long enough, and when there was no immediate need for him to work alongside his mother. The teachers who remembered him later described a bright boy who learned quickly but had difficulty sitting still, as if some restless energy drove him to seek something beyond the confines of any classroom. The boy learned to read and write during those Indiana years, skills that would serve him well in ways no one could have predicted. His handwriting, when examples of it survived, was careful and neat, the penmanship of someone who took pride in the appearance of his words on paper. He developed a love for dime novels, the cheap adventure stories that filled his imagination with tales of cowboys and outlaws, Indians and settlers, all living lives of freedom and excitement that seemed impossibly distant from his own quiet existence. Catherine McCarty met William Antrim in Indiana, though the exact circumstances of their meeting have been lost to time. Antrim was a man with kind eyes and calloused hands, someone who had worked various jobs throughout the Midwest, and who treated Catherine's son with the patient affection of a man who understood what it meant to be alone in the world. Henry, who had no memory of his biological father, accepted Antrim's presence with the easy adaptability of a child who had learned that security was something that came and went without warning. The small family continued their westward migration, drawn by stories of opportunity in the territories beyond the Mississippi River. Antrim had heard about silver mining in New Mexico territory, where a man could stake a claim and perhaps strike it rich, or at least make a decent living extracting precious metals from the ancient mountains. The idea appealed to Catherine, who was tired of the constant struggle to make ends meet in the increasingly crowded Midwest. Their journey to New Mexico was long and arduous, undertaken in stages over several months as they earned money for the next portion of their travels. They rode on trains when they could afford tickets, walked when they could not, and sometimes caught rides on freight wagons with drivers willing to accept a few coins in exchange for passage. Henry, now approaching his teens, began to understand that their destination wasn't just another temporary stop, but a place where his mother hoped to build something permanent. The New Mexico territory of the early 1870s was a land caught between worlds. Ancient Pueblo settlements sat alongside rough mining camps, Spanish colonial architecture, weathered by centuries of sun and wind, stood near hastily constructed American towns, and the vast landscape seemed to swallow human ambitions while simultaneously inspiring them. It was here, in this place, where cultures mixed and often clashed, that Henry McCarty would complete his transformation from a fatherless boy into the figure history would remember. Silver City, New Mexico, became their home in a way that no previous destination had been. Catherine found steady work as a cook and boarding house keeper, while Antrim tried his hand at prospecting and various other ventures. Henry attended school more regularly than he had in years, impressing his teachers with his intelligence and quick wit, though they also noted his tendency toward restlessness and occasional mischief. The house where they lived was small but clean, with thick adobe walls that kept the interior cool during the blazing summer days and warm during the cold desert nights. Henry had his own small room, perhaps the first private space he had ever possessed, where he could keep his few treasures, some dime novels, a knife Antrim had given him, and letters from people they had met during their travels. For a brief time, it seemed as though the McCarty family had found the stability they had been seeking for so many years. Catherine's health, however, began to fail during their time in Silver City. The years of hard work and constant worry had taken their toll, and she developed a persistent cough that grew worse as the months passed. The high desert air, which was supposed to be beneficial for respiratory ailments, seemed to offer her little relief. Henry watched his mother's gradual decline with the helpless concern of a son who understood that the person who had been his anchor in the world was slowly slipping away from him. The tuberculosis that claimed Catherine McCarty was a common killer in the 19th century, striking without regard for the dreams and plans of its victims. She died quietly in September 1874, leaving behind a teenage son who suddenly found himself alone in a world that had never been particularly kind to orphans. Henry was 14 years old enough to understand the finality of death, but still young enough to feel utterly lost without the guiding presence of the woman who had shaped his earliest years. William Antrim, though a decent man, was not equipped to raise a teenage boy on his own. His relationship with Henry had been cordial, but distant, lacking the deep bond that might have sustained them both through grief. After Catherine's funeral, conducted in the small cemetery overlooking Silver City, Antrim made arrangements for Henry to board with other families while he continued his attempts at mining and business ventures. The boy who had been Henry McCarty found himself adrift in Silver City, living with families who took him in more out of duty than affection. He attended school when he could, worked odd jobs to pay for his keep, and began to develop the independence that would characterize the rest of his short life. The loss of his mother had severed his last connection to conventional family life, setting him on a path that would lead inevitably toward the margins of society. It was during this period of grief and adjustment that Henry began to display the restless energy that would define his teenage years. He was intelligent and articulate, capable of charming adults when he chose to do so. But he also possessed a growing impatience with authority and conventional expectations. The boy who had learned early to rely on himself was beginning to understand that the world expected him to find his own way, with little help from others. The Silver City of Henry McCarty's adolescence was a community balanced precariously between respectability and frontier roughness. Main Street boasted a few substantial buildings constructed of local stone. their thick walls and small windows speaking to both the harsh climate and the occasional need for defense. But most of the town consisted of adobe structures and wooden frame buildings that seemed temporary, as though their inhabitants expected to move on when the silver played out or better opportunities beckoned from elsewhere. Henry found work where he could, sweeping floors in the local hotel, delivering messages for the newspaper, helping merchants load and unload wagons that brought supplies from distant railheads. The work was irregular and poorly paid, but it allowed him to remain independent rather than becoming a permanent burden on the families who had taken him in after his mother's death. He moved from boarding house to boarding house, never staying long enough to form deep attachments, but always managing to find a roof over his head and enough food to keep growing. The other young men in Silver City came from families with established roots in the community, boys whose fathers owned shops or worked steady jobs in the mines. Henry's status as an outsider, an orphan with no permanent address and no family connections, marked him as different in ways that became more pronounced as he entered his mid-teens. He was articulate and well-read, qualities that impressed adults but sometimes irritated his peers, who found his quick wit and easy confidence unsettling. School records from Silver City show that Henry was an able student when he attended classes regularly. But his attendance became increasingly sporadic as he grew older. The need to work for his own support often conflicted with the school schedule, and the informal nature of frontier education meant that teachers had little authority to compel regular attendance from students who were essentially supporting themselves. Henry's education became increasingly self-directed, supplemented by the books he could borrow or buy, and the conversations he had with the varied characters who passed through Silver City. The theft that changed everything happened on a quiet September day in 1875, when Henry was 16 years old. The details, as preserved in court records and newspaper accounts, reveal a crime born more of teenage mischief than genuine criminal intent. Henry and another boy had taken some clothes from a Chinese laundry, apparently as a prank rather than from any serious need for the garments. The Chinese laundry was an easy target for local troublemakers, as the owner had little influence in the community and even less protection from the authorities. When the theft was discovered, the local sheriff arrested both boys and placed them in the small jail that served Silver City and the surrounding area. The jail was a simple structure, built more to hold drunks and disturbers of the peace overnight than to contain serious criminals for extended periods. Henry found himself confined in a cell with stone walls and iron bars, contemplating a future that suddenly seemed far more uncertain than it had just days before. The charge was minor by frontier standards, the kind of youthful indiscretion that might result in a fine, some community service, or a stern lecture from a judge. But Henry's position as an orphan, with no family to vouch for his character or pay his fines, meant that the legal system would treat him more harshly than it might a boy with better connections. He faced the possibility of several months in jail, followed by a criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. It was during his brief imprisonment that Henry made the decision that would set him on the path to becoming Billy the Kid. Rather than waiting for the legal system to determine his fate, he squeezed through a gap in the jail's construction and escaped into the New Mexico night. The escape itself was unremarkable, the kind of thing that happened regularly in frontier jails built more for convenience than security. But for Henry, it represented a point of no return, the moment when he chose to place himself outside the law rather than submit to its judgment. The boy who walked away from the Silver City jail was no longer the same person who had entered it just days before. Henry McCarty, the orphaned son of an Irish immigrant woman, was about to disappear entirely, replaced by a series of assumed names and identities that would allow him to move freely through the Southwest. The transformation was both practical and psychological, a conscious decision to shed his past and reinvent himself as someone who owed nothing to conventional society and expected nothing from it in return. His first destination after escaping from jail was the camp of John Mackey, a Scotsman who ran a small ranch outside Silver City and who had occasionally employed Henry for odd jobs. Mackey was the kind of man who asked few questions about a person's background, more interested in their willingness to work than their previous entanglements with the law. Henry worked for Mackey for several weeks, helping with the cattle and learning the basic skills of frontier ranching that would serve him well in the years to come. But Silver City was too small and too close for comfort. Word of Henry's escape had spread throughout the community, and he knew that his continued presence in the area would eventually lead to his recapture and return to jail. After collecting his wages from Mackey, Henry set out for Arizona Territory, where he hoped to lose himself in the mining camps and cattle towns that dotted the desert landscape. The journey to Arizona marked the beginning of Henry's life as a drifter, moving from place to place as circumstances dictated, never staying long enough to put down roots, but always managing to find work and shelter. He traveled light, carrying only what he could fit in a small bundle, a change of clothes, a few precious books, and the .41 caliber revolver that Mackey had given him as a parting gift. The gun was more tool than weapon in that time and place, as necessary for a man traveling alone as a hat or boots. Arizona Territory in the mid-1870s was a land of extreme contrasts, where ancient desert landscapes hosted boom towns that sprang up around mineral deposits and just as quickly disappeared when the mines played out. Henry found work in several of these temporary communities, loading ore cars, tending horses, and performing the countless small jobs that kept frontier settlements functioning. He was careful to use different names in different places, sometimes calling himself Henry Antrim after his stepfather, sometimes William Bonney after a character in one of his favorite dime novels. The name William Bonney seemed to suit him particularly well, perhaps because it sounded both respectable and adventurous, the kind of name that belonged to a young man making his own way in the world. Those who met him during this period remembered a slight but agile youth with sandy hair and bright blue eyes, someone who was quick to smile and equally quick to take offense if he felt he was being treated unfairly. He had developed the frontier virtues of self-reliance and physical courage, But he had also acquired some of the frontier vices, a tendency toward violence when cornered, and a distrust of authority in all its forms. The incident that would earn William Bonney his first real notoriety occurred in August 1877 in a small saloon in the Arizona mining camp of Bonita. The details vary depending on who told the story, but the essential facts seem clear enough. Henry, now going by the name William Bonney, had been drinking and playing cards with several other men when a dispute arose. The other man, a local tough named Frank Cahill, was larger and stronger than the slight teenager, and when words led to physical confrontation, Henry found himself overmatched in a straight fight. What happened next would be debated for decades afterward. According to some accounts, Cahill was bullying the younger man, using his size and strength to humiliate someone he saw as an easy target. According to others, Henry was the aggressor, quick to resort to violence when he felt his pride was threatened. What seems certain is that Henry drew his revolver and shot Cahill, inflicting a wound that would prove fatal within a few days. The shooting in Bonita was Henry's first killing, though it would not be his last. Unlike the dramatic gunfights of popular fiction, the actual event was sordid and brief, ending with one man dying slowly of infection, while another fled into the desert to avoid the rough justice that frontier communities sometimes dispensed to those who disturbed their peace. Henry's flight from Arizona marked another stage in his transformation from orphaned boy to wanted fugitive. The long ride back to New Mexico gave Henry time to consider his situation and his future. At 18 years old, he was now a killer as well as an escaped prisoner, someone who would have to remain constantly alert to the possibility of pursuit and capture. But he was also free in ways that few people ever experience, answerable to no one but himself, and limited only by his own courage and ingenuity. The boy who had once dreamed of a stable home and conventional respectability was learning to find satisfaction in the dangerous freedom of life outside the law. New Mexico territory welcomed him back with the indifference that characterized frontier society's attitude toward newcomers. As long as a man could work and pay his way, few people cared about his past or his real name. Henry, now permanently established as William Bonney in his own mind, found employment on various ranches throughout the southeastern part of the territory, learning the skills of a cowboy and developing the expertise with horses and cattle that would make him valuable to employers who needed reliable help in managing their herds. The work suited him in ways that his previous occupations had not. Cattle ranching required a combination of independence and cooperation, the ability to work alone for long periods while still functioning as part of a team when circumstances demanded it. Henry discovered that he had a natural aptitude for handling livestock and an instinctive understanding of the harsh but beautiful landscape that surrounded him. For the first time since his mother's death, he began to feel as though he had found a place where he might belong. The New Mexico territory that welcomed William Bonney back in 1877 was a land caught between two worlds and struggling to define its identity. Ancient Spanish and Mexican traditions persisted in the older settlements, where adobe churches still called the faithful to worship in the language of Cervantes, and land grants, dating back centuries, determined who could graze cattle where. But American influence was growing stronger each year, bringing new laws, new customs, and new conflicts that would reshape the entire region. Lincoln County, where Henry would make his mark on history, stretched across nearly 30,000 square miles of high desert and mountain country in the southeastern portion of the territory. It was a landscape of stunning beauty and harsh realities, where summer thunderstorms could flood dry arroyos in minutes, and winter blizzards could isolate settlements for weeks at a time. The county seat was the village of Lincoln, a single street lined with adobe buildings that had served as the administrative center for the region since the days when New Mexico was still part of Mexico. The economic heart of Lincoln County was cattle ranching, an industry that had evolved from the Spanish colonial tradition of large land grants worked by vaqueros who had perfected their skills over generations. American settlers had adapted these techniques to their own purposes, establishing ranches that ran thousands of head of cattle on the open range, where grass and water were free to anyone bold enough to claim them and strong enough to hold them against competitors. But cattle ranching was only part of the story. The county also contained significant mineral deposits, timber resources, and agricultural potential that attracted investors and entrepreneurs from as far away as New York and London. These diverse interests often conflicted with each other and with the territorial government's attempts to bring order to a region that had traditionally governed itself according to informal codes of honor and mutual respect. Into this complex environment came William Bonney, looking for work and hoping to build a life for himself in a place where his past might matter less than his ability to contribute to the present. He found employment with John Tunstall, an Englishman who had come to New Mexico with ambitious plans to establish a cattle ranch and general store that would compete with the established businesses that dominated the local economy. Tunstall was 24 years old, just 6 years older than Henry, but he possessed the kind of educated confidence that came from a privileged background and excellent connections. His father was a successful businessman in London, and John had come to New Mexico with sufficient capital to establish himself as a significant player in the local economy. He was intelligent, idealistic, and perhaps dangerously naive about the realities of frontier politics and business competition. The Englishman's ranch was located on the Rio Feliz, about 30 miles south of Lincoln, in a valley that provided good grass and reliable water for his growing herd of cattle. Tunstall had grand plans for the property, envisioning not just a successful ranching operation, but a model community where honest dealing and fair treatment would replace the corruption and violence that plagued much of the frontier. He hired good men and paid them well, treating his employees with a respect that was unusual in an industry where cowhands were often regarded as little better than seasonal laborers. Henry found in Tunstall something he had not experienced since his mother's death, an employer who took a genuine interest in his welfare and seemed to see potential in him beyond his immediate usefulness as a ranch hand. Tunstall encouraged Henry's love of reading, lending him books from his own collection and engaging him in conversations about subjects ranging from literature to politics to philosophy. The relationship between the well-educated Englishman and the self-taught American orphan was one of mutual respect and growing friendship. Under Tunstall's influence, Henry began to think about his future in ways that went beyond mere survival. The Englishman spoke of the opportunities that would be available to capable young men as New Mexico developed into a proper state with established institutions and regular commerce. He suggested that Henry's intelligence and natural leadership abilities could carry him far if he chose to apply them constructively rather than destructively. The work on Tunstall's ranch was varied and engaging, requiring both physical skills and mental alertness. Henry helped manage the cattle herds, maintained ranch equipment, and occasionally traveled to Lincoln or other settlements to conduct business on Tunstall's behalf. These trips gave him a deeper understanding of the complex web of relationships and rivalries that shaped local politics and commerce. Lincoln County's troubles stemmed largely from the conflict between two factions that represented different visions of the region's future. On one side was Lawrence Murphy, an Irishman who had served in the military before establishing himself as one of the county's most powerful businessmen. Murphy owned the largest general store in Lincoln, held significant government contracts, and controlled much of the credit that kept smaller ranchers and farmers operating from season to season. Murphy's business partner was James Dolan, another Irishman who shared his mentor's ruthless approach to competition and his willingness to use political connections to maintain their economic dominance. Together, Murphy and Dolan had created what amounted to a monopoly on much of the county's commerce, charging high prices for necessities and paying low prices for cattle and other products they purchased from local producers. The Murphy-Dolan faction was supported by Sheriff William Brady, a man whose loyalty to his political patrons often outweighed his commitment to impartial law enforcement. Brady was not necessarily corrupt in the conventional sense, but he clearly understood that his continued employment depended on maintaining the status quo that kept Murphy and Dolan in control of the county's economic life. On the other side of the conflict were newcomers like Tunstall, who refused to accept the existing system and who possessed sufficient resources to challenge it directly. These men saw opportunity in Lincoln County's vast resources and growing population, but they also recognized that meaningful development would require breaking the stranglehold that a few established interests held over local commerce and politics. The specific issue that would trigger the Lincoln County War was Tunstall's decision to open a general store in the village of Lincoln that would compete directly with Murphy and Dolan's established business. The Englishman had formed a partnership with Alexander McSween, a lawyer who had moved to Lincoln from Kansas and who brought both legal expertise and additional capital to their venture. McSween was a devout Presbyterian who shared Tunstall's commitment to honest dealing and who possessed the legal knowledge necessary to navigate the complex regulations that governed territorial commerce. The Tunstall-McSween store opened in late 1877, offering local ranchers and farmers an alternative to the high prices and restrictive credit terms that had long characterized their dealings with Murphy and Dolan. The new store paid better prices for cattle and agricultural products while charging less for manufactured goods, a business model that was possible only because Tunstall and McSween were willing to accept smaller profit margins in exchange for larger market share. Henry watched these developments with the keen interest of someone who was learning how power operated in frontier society. He saw how economic competition quickly became personal rivalry, and how personal rivalry could escalate into the kind of conflict that threatened the stability of entire communities. The lessons he absorbed during this period would shape his understanding of loyalty, justice, and survival for the rest of his short life. The atmosphere in Lincoln County grew increasingly tense as 1877 turned into 1878. Murphy and Dolan were losing business to their new competitors, and they began to use their political connections to harass Tunstall and McSween through legal channels. Sheriff Brady issued warrants for various alleged violations of territorial law, while friendly judges issued injunctions designed to interfere with the operation of the competing store. Tunstall, for his part, seemed almost oblivious to the danger that his challenge to the established order was creating. He continued to conduct business as though Lincoln County were governed by the same laws and customs that prevailed in London or New York, apparently believing that honesty and fair dealing would ultimately triumph over corruption and intimidation. His confidence in the ultimate justice of his cause was admirable, but perhaps dangerously naive, given the realities of frontier politics. Henry began to understand that the conflict between Tunstall and his enemies would not be resolved through legal channels or peaceful competition. The established powers in Lincoln County had too much to lose to allow their monopoly to be broken without a fight, and they possessed both the political connections and the willingness to use violence that might prove decisive in any serious confrontation. The boy who had fled from Arizona after his first killing was about to learn that violence was often the final arbiter of disputes on the frontier. The winter of 1877 to 1878 passed quietly on Tunstall's ranch, but Henry could sense the tension building throughout the county as spring approached. Conversations in Lincoln's saloons and stores grew more heated, and men began to choose sides in the conflict that everyone knew was coming. The question was not whether violence would erupt, but when it would begin and how far it would spread before it finally burned itself out. The morning of February 18th, 1878, dawned clear and cold over the high desert country of Lincoln County. John Tunstall had ridden out from his ranch with several of his men, including William Bonney, to move some horses to a different pasture and to check on the condition of his cattle after a series of winter storms. It was routine work, the kind of everyday ranching activity that had occupied much of Henry's time since coming to work for the Englishman. But nothing about this day would prove routine. Unknown to Tunstall and his companions, Sheriff Brady had organized a posse to serve legal papers related to the ongoing business dispute between Tunstall and the Murphy-Dolan faction. The posse included not only Brady's deputies, but also several men who were known enemies of Tunstall, individuals whose involvement in what was supposed to be a legal proceeding suggested that something more than law enforcement was planned. The encounter occurred in a canyon about 5 miles from Tunstall's ranch, where the Englishman and his men had stopped to rest their horses and eat a simple lunch of bread and dried beef. Henry was checking the hooves of his mount when one of the other cowboys spotted riders approaching from the direction of Lincoln. The men were still too distant to identify, but their purposeful approach and large numbers suggested that this was not a chance meeting of neighbors. Tunstall, characteristically, seemed more curious than alarmed by the approaching riders. He had faith in the legal system and confidence that his own conduct had been beyond reproach, so he saw no reason to flee from what he assumed was an official legal proceeding. Henry and the other ranch hands were less sanguine, having observed the deteriorating relationship between their employer and the established powers in Lincoln County. As the posse drew closer, it became clear that this was not a routine service of legal papers. The men were heavily armed and seemed more prepared for a fight than for a peaceful legal proceeding. Tunstall's cowboys urged him to retreat to the ranch, where they could take defensive positions and send for help. But the Englishman refused to run from what he still believed was a legitimate law enforcement action. The shooting began without warning or explanation. One moment, Tunstall was sitting on his horse, discussing the situation with his men, and the next moment, bullets were flying from the rocks above the canyon. The attack was sudden and overwhelming, giving Tunstall's small party no opportunity to defend themselves or negotiate a peaceful resolution to whatever grievances had motivated the assault. John Tunstall died quickly, shot from his horse by men who had claimed to be serving the cause of law and order. His death was not the result of a fair fight or even a heated argument that had escalated beyond control. It was an assassination, carried out by men who had decided that their economic and political interests were more important than human life or legal procedure. Henry watched his employer and friend die from a position behind a large boulder where he had taken cover when the shooting started. The boy who had killed Frank Cahill in Arizona was no stranger to violence, but the cold-blooded murder of John Tunstall affected him in ways that his previous experiences had not prepared him for. This was not a bar-room fight between equals, but the calculated elimination of a man whose only crime had been his refusal to accept the corrupt system that dominated Lincoln County. The surviving members of Tunstall's party scattered into the rocks and brush, using their knowledge of the local terrain to evade the posse members who pursued them with the enthusiasm of hunters chasing dangerous game. Henry managed to reach the ranch by a circuitous route, arriving after dark with news of Tunstall's death and warning that the conflict had escalated beyond anything the Englishman's supporters had anticipated. The murder of John Tunstall transformed what had been a business dispute into something approaching a private war. The Englishman's death eliminated any possibility that the conflict could be resolved through legal channels or peaceful negotiation, and it created a group of men who were now committed to seeking justice through whatever means proved necessary. Alexander McSween, Tunstall's business partner, became the nominal leader of the faction that opposed Murphy and Dolan, but he was a lawyer rather than a fighting man, more comfortable with legal briefs than with the kind of direct action that the situation now seemed to require. The real leadership of what came to be known as the Regulators fell to men like Charlie Bowder and Doc Scurlock, experienced fighters who understood that they were now engaged in a struggle where the law would provide little protection. Henry's transformation into Billy the Kid began in earnest during the weeks following Tunstall's murder. The boy who had worked peacefully on the Englishman's ranch was replaced by a young man burning with a desire for revenge against those who had killed his employer and friend. He joined the regulators with the fervor of someone who had found a cause worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. The regulators were not outlaws in the conventional sense, at least not initially. They had been deputized by Justice of the Peace John Wilson, who was sympathetic to Tunstall's cause and who possessed the legal authority to commission a posse to investigate the Englishman's murder and arrest those responsible. But Wilson's authority was disputed by other territorial officials, and the Murphy-Dolan faction refused to recognize the legitimacy of warrants issued by someone they considered a partisan enemy. The result was a situation where two groups of armed men, each claiming to represent law and order, roamed Lincoln County seeking to arrest or eliminate their enemies. Sheriff Brady supported the Murphy-Dolan faction, while the regulators operated under warrants issued by Justice Wilson. Neither side acknowledged the authority of the other, and both were prepared to use deadly force to advance their cause. Henry's first significant action as a regulator came in early March 1878, when the group attempted to arrest several members of the posse that had killed Tunstall. The confrontation occurred near the small settlement of Blazes Mills, where Henry and his companions had tracked their quarry after receiving information about their whereabouts from local sympathizers. The fight at Blazes Mills was brief but deadly, resulting in the deaths of several men on both sides, but failing to achieve the regulators' primary objective of capturing Tunstall's killers. Henry distinguished himself during the engagement by his coolness under fire and his accurate shooting, qualities that earned him the respect of his more experienced companions and established his reputation as someone who could be counted on in a crisis. The violence at Blazes Mills was followed by a series of similar encounters throughout Lincoln County, as both factions sought to eliminate their enemies and establish control over the disputed territory. The conflict was characterized by ambushes, night raids, and sudden confrontations that left dead men on both sides, but resolved nothing in terms of the underlying political and economic issues that had caused the war. On April 1st, 1878, the regulators achieved their most significant victory when they succeeded in killing Sheriff Brady and one of his deputies in an ambush on Lincoln's main street. The attack was carefully planned and flawlessly executed, with Henry and his companions taking positions behind an adobe wall that provided perfect cover for their assault on the lawmen who had supported their enemies. Henry's role in Brady's assassination marked his complete transformation from ranch hand to outlaw. The boy who had once hoped to build a respectable life in New Mexico territory was now a wanted man with a price on his head, someone who would have to spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder for bounty hunters and law enforcement officers. But he seemed to accept this fate with equanimity, perhaps recognizing that his path had been determined by forces beyond his control. The death of Sheriff Brady didn't end the Lincoln County War. But it did mark the beginning of its final phase. The territorial government in Santa Fe finally began to take notice of the situation in Lincoln County, dispatching military units to restore order and appointing new officials who were expected to remain neutral in the conflict between the warring factions. The new sheriff was George Pepin, a man who was supposed to represent impartial law enforcement, but who quickly aligned himself with the Murphy-Dolan faction. His appointment made it clear that the territorial government either did not understand the true nature of the conflict in Lincoln County or had decided to support the established powers against the insurgent regulators. Henry and his companions found themselves increasingly isolated as the spring of 1878 turned into summer. The military presence in the county made large-scale operations impossible, but it didn't end the cycle of violence that had begun with Tunstall's murder. Instead, the conflict devolved into a series of smaller engagements as individual regulators sought personal revenge against their enemies while avoiding the army patrols that now crisscrossed the disputed territory. The final major engagement of the Lincoln County War occurred in July 1878, when Henry and about a dozen other regulators took refuge in Alexander McSween's house in Lincoln. They had been driven there by a combination of Pepin's deputies and soldiers from nearby Fort Stanton, and they found themselves surrounded by superior forces with little hope of escape. The siege of McSween's house lasted for 3 days, during which the defenders held off repeated attacks while hoping that sympathizers would come to their aid. Henry moved from window to window, firing carefully aimed shots at their besiegers while conserving ammunition that was running dangerously low. The house's thick adobe walls provided good protection against small arms fire, but everyone inside understood that their situation was ultimately hopeless. On the final day of the siege, Pepin's men set fire to McSween's house, using the simple expedient of throwing burning brands onto the wooden roof. The defenders were forced to choose between dying in the flames and making a desperate break for freedom through the ring of armed men who surrounded them. McSween chose to surrender, walking out of his burning home with his hands raised, only to be shot down in cold blood by men who had no intention of taking prisoners. Henry escaped during the confusion that followed McSween's murder, slipping out of the burning house and making his way through the darkness to safety. His survival, while so many of his companions died, seemed to confirm the growing legend that he led a charmed life, protected by luck or fate from the bullets that claimed other men. But the boy who emerged from the ashes of McSween's house was fundamentally changed by the experience, marked by the knowledge that he was now alone in a hostile world with few friends and many enemies. The Lincoln County War officially ended with McSween's death, though sporadic violence would continue for months afterward as survivors from both sides settled personal scores and pursued private vendettas. The territorial government declared an amnesty for most participants in the conflict, but Henry's prominent role in several killings, including Sheriff Brady's assassination, made him ineligible for the general pardon that allowed other regulators to return to peaceful lives. The transformation of William Bonney into Billy the Kid was not the work of a single moment, but rather a gradual process that unfolded over the months following the end of the Lincoln County War. The young man who had fought alongside the regulators was still largely unknown outside of southeastern New Mexico, but that anonymity would not last long in a territory where news traveled quickly and where stories grew in the telling. The first newspaper accounts of the Lincoln County troubles began appearing in territorial papers during the summer of 1878, as reporters and correspondents tried to make sense of the complex conflict that had convulsed one of New Mexico's largest counties. These early stories were often inaccurate and sensationalized, written by men who had not witnessed the events they described and who relied on second-hand accounts from partisan sources. Henry found his name mentioned in several of these newspaper reports, usually as the Kid or Billy the Kid, nicknames that emphasized his youth and his growing reputation as a dangerous gunman. The journalists who wrote these stories seemed fascinated by the idea of a teenager who had become a killer, and they began to embellish his exploits with details that bore little resemblance to reality. The newspaper coverage created a version of Billy the Kid that was more dramatic and more violent than the actual William Bonney who rode the trails of New Mexico territory. According to these accounts, he was a cold-blooded killer who had murdered dozens of men, a youth whose baby face concealed the heart of a remorseless assassin. The real Billy was dangerous enough, but the legendary Billy the Kid was a figure of almost supernatural menace. The discrepancy between legend and reality troubled Henry, who found himself credited with killings he had not committed and crimes he had never contemplated. But he also recognized that his reputation, however exaggerated, provided him with a certain protection in a world where a man's survival often depended on others' perception of his willingness and ability to defend himself. The dime novels that had entertained Henry during his childhood began to feature characters based on his exploits, though these fictional versions bore even less resemblance to reality than the newspaper accounts. The publishers of these cheap adventure stories were more interested in creating exciting narratives than in maintaining historical accuracy, and they transformed Billy the Kid into a figure of pure fiction who happened to share a name with a real person. Songs about Billy the Kid began to circulate throughout the Southwest, carried by cowboys and drifters who had heard fragments of his story and who elaborated on them for the entertainment of their companions around campfires and in saloons. These ballads portrayed him sometimes as a hero and sometimes as a villain, but always as a figure larger than life, someone whose adventures were worthy of being preserved in verse and passed down through generations. The real William Bonney, meanwhile, was struggling to find his place in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to his continued existence. The amnesty that had ended the Lincoln County War specifically excluded him from its provisions, meaning that he remained a wanted man with a price on his head. Law enforcement officers throughout New Mexico territory had been alerted to watch for him, and bounty hunters were beginning to show interest in collecting the reward that had been offered for his capture. Despite his outlaw status, Henry found that many people in New Mexico were sympathetic to his situation, particularly those who had suffered under the corrupt system that the Murphy-Dolan faction had represented. These sympathizers provided him with food, shelter, and information about the movements of his enemies, creating an informal network of support that allowed him to remain at large despite the efforts of law enforcement to capture him. Henry's correspondence from this period, some of which survived in the files of territorial officials, reveals a young man who was more thoughtful and articulate than his reputation suggested. He wrote letters to Governor Lew Wallace requesting amnesty and describing his version of the events that had led to his outlaw status. These letters were carefully composed and respectful in tone, written by someone who still hoped that the legal system might provide him with a path back to respectability. Governor Wallace, who would later achieve fame as the author of the novel Ben-Hur, was intrigued by Henry's letters and agreed to meet with him in March 1879 to discuss the possibility of a pardon in exchange for testimony about corruption in Lincoln County. The meeting took place in Lincoln itself, in a small adobe house where the two men sat across from each other at a simple wooden table and discussed the young outlaw's future. Henry impressed Wallace with his intelligence and apparent sincerity, and the governor seemed genuinely interested in finding a way to resolve the situation that would benefit both the territory and the young man who had become its most notorious outlaw. Wallace offered Henry a full pardon in exchange for his testimony before a grand jury investigating the Lincoln County troubles, and Henry agreed to the arrangement with the hope that he could finally put his violent past behind him. The grand jury proceedings took place in April 1879, with Henry providing detailed testimony about the events he had witnessed during the Lincoln County War. He spoke carefully and precisely, describing the murders and corruption he had observed while avoiding any admissions that might further incriminate him in crimes for which he had not yet been charged. His testimony was valuable to prosecutors seeking to understand the complex web of relationships and rivalries that had produced so much violence. But the promised pardon never materialized. Political considerations and pressure from powerful interests made it impossible for Wallace to fulfill his commitment to Henry, leaving the young outlaw feeling betrayed by yet another authority figure who had promised more than he could deliver. The failure of the amnesty negotiations marked the end of Henry's attempts to resolve his legal problems through official channels. Freed from any hope of legal redemption, Henry embraced his role as Billy the Kid with a fatalistic acceptance that seemed to surprise those who knew him well. He no longer sought to hide his identity or avoid the attention that his reputation brought him. Instead, he seemed to take a perverse pride in the fear and fascination that his name inspired, playing up to the image that newspapers and dime novels had created for him. The Billy the Kid who emerged from the failed amnesty negotiations was different from the William Bonney who had worked for John Tunstall, or even the young regulator who had fought in the Lincoln County War. This new version was more reckless and more theatrical, someone who seemed to understand that his life had become a performance for an audience that would never allow him to step off the stage. Henry's activities during the spring and summer of 1879 were a mixture of criminal enterprise and social interaction that reflected the complex nature of his situation in New Mexico territory. He rustled cattle from large ranches whose owners could afford the losses, but he also attended dances and social gatherings, where he was welcomed by young women who found his dangerous reputation exciting rather than frightening. The cattle rustling was not particularly lucrative, but it provided Henry with enough money to maintain his independence while avoiding the kind of legitimate employment that would have made him easy to locate and arrest. He worked with a small group of companions who shared his outlaw status, men who had also been excluded from the general amnesty and who had few options other than crime. But Henry's social life revealed a different side of his personality, one that contradicted the image of a cold-blooded killer that had been created by newspaper accounts and dime novels. At dances and parties, he was charming and polite, someone who clearly enjoyed the company of respectable people, even though his own reputation placed him outside the bounds of respectable society. The contrast between Billy the Kid, the legend, and William Bonney, the person, became increasingly pronounced as 1879 turned into 1880. The legend continued to grow, fed by new stories and songs that attributed ever more spectacular exploits to the young outlaw. But the person was becoming increasingly isolated, caught between a reputation that made normal relationships impossible and a legal status that offered no hope of redemption. The capture of Billy the Kid came not through the dramatic confrontation that his reputation might have suggested, but through the patient work of a determined lawman who understood that even the most notorious outlaw could not remain free forever in a territory where law enforcement was becoming more organized and more effective. Pat Garrett had been elected sheriff of Lincoln County in November 1880, running on a platform that promised to bring law and order to a region that had been plagued by violence and crime for too many years. Garrett was a tall, lean man with the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of experience on the frontier, someone who had worked as a cowboy and buffalo hunter before turning to law enforcement as a way to serve his community. Garrett's pursuit of Billy the Kid was methodical and relentless, based on careful intelligence gathering rather than dramatic confrontations. He cultivated informants throughout Lincoln County, creating a network of people who were willing to provide information about the outlaw's movements in exchange for money or simply out of civic duty. The sheriff understood that Billy's freedom depended on the support of local sympathizers, and he worked systematically to undermine that support. The end came in December 1880, when Garrett and his deputies surrounded a small stone house at Stinking Springs, about 40 miles east of Fort Sumner, where Billy and several companions had taken shelter during a winter storm. The building was isolated and offered little opportunity for escape, particularly with snow on the ground that would make tracking fugitives a simple matter. Billy's capture was accomplished without the gunfight that many people expected. Surrounded and outnumbered, with no hope of escape and little prospect of rescue, he chose to surrender rather than die in a hopeless battle. The decision reflected a practical assessment of his situation rather than cowardice, the choice of someone who preferred to take his chances with the legal system rather than face certain death in a shootout. The young man who walked out of the stone house with his hands raised bore little resemblance to the larger-than-life figure that newspapers and dime novels had created. He was slightly built, weighing perhaps 140 pounds, with sandy hair and blue eyes that seemed younger than his 21 years. Those who saw him for the first time were often surprised by his ordinary appearance, having expected someone more physically imposing based on his fearsome reputation. Garrett transported his prisoner to Las Vegas, New Mexico, where Billy was held in the jail while authorities determined where he should be tried for his various alleged crimes. The Las Vegas jail was more secure than the frontier lockups Billy had known in his youth, with thick stone walls and iron bars that had been designed to hold serious criminals rather than casual troublemakers. The newspaper coverage of Billy's capture was extensive and sensationalized, with reporters traveling from as far away as Denver and Kansas City to interview the famous outlaw and to write stories about his upcoming trial. These journalists found Billy to be articulate and charming, quite different from the savage killer they had expected to encounter based on the stories that had been written about him. Billy seemed to enjoy the attention that his capture brought him, perhaps recognizing that fame, even notorious fame, was preferable to the anonymity that would have marked his existence if he had remained a simple cowboy or ranch hand. He spoke freely with reporters, telling stories about his adventures and offering his perspective on the events that had made him famous throughout the American West. But the interviews also revealed a more serious side of his personality, as Billy spoke about his regret for the violent path his life had taken, and his hope that he might somehow find a way to make amends for his past actions. These moments of reflection suggested that the young outlaw was more complex than his public image indicated, someone who understood the consequences of his choices even if he felt powerless to change them. The trial was held in Mesilla, New Mexico, in April 1881, with Billy facing charges related to the murder of Sheriff Brady during the Lincoln County War. The proceedings were conducted in a small courthouse that was packed with spectators who had come to see the famous outlaw face justice for his crimes. The atmosphere was more like that of a theatrical performance than a solemn legal proceeding. Billy's defense attorney argued that his client had been acting as a duly deputized member of the regulators when Brady was killed, making the shooting a legal act of law enforcement rather than murder. But the prosecution successfully demonstrated that the regulator's authority had been questionable at best, and that Billy's participation in what amounted to an assassination could not be justified under any reasonable interpretation of territorial law. The verdict was guilty, and the sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out in Lincoln on May 13th, 1881. Billy received the news with apparent calm, though those who knew him well detected signs of the strain that the proceedings had placed on him. The boy who had once hoped to build a respectable life in New Mexico territory was now scheduled to die before his 22nd birthday. The journey back to Lincoln for execution was conducted under heavy guard, with Garrett personally supervising the transportation of his famous prisoner. Billy was shackled and closely watched, but he seemed resigned to his fate, perhaps understanding that the web of circumstances that had trapped him was too strong to break through any desperate last-minute escape attempt. The Lincoln jail where Billy awaited execution was the same building where he had been held briefly as a boy after his first arrest for stealing laundry. The irony was not lost on him as he commented to his guards about the changes that had occurred in the town during the years since his youth. Lincoln had grown and become more civilized, but it was still the same small community where his troubles had begun so many years before. Billy's cell was on the second floor of the courthouse, a room with barred windows that looked out over the main street where so much of the violence of the Lincoln County War had occurred. From his window, he could see the spot where Sheriff Brady had been killed, a reminder of the events that had brought him to this final confrontation with the law. The guards who watched Billy during his final weeks were men who had known him during his outlaw years, and many of them treated him with a respect that bordered on friendship. They played cards with him, brought him books to read, and engaged him in conversation about subjects ranging from politics to literature to philosophy. These interactions revealed a side of Billy's personality that few people had ever seen, the thoughtful and well-read young man who existed beneath the notorious outlaw. Billy's correspondence during this period showed a young man grappling with the reality of his approaching death while trying to maintain his dignity and composure. He wrote letters to friends and acquaintances, often expressing gratitude for kindnesses they had shown him and regret for the trouble his actions had caused them. These letters were carefully composed and free of self-pity, written by someone who had accepted responsibility for his choices, even if he regretted their consequences. The date of execution approached with the inexorable certainty of sunrise, marked by the construction of gallows in the courthouse yard and the arrival of witnesses from throughout New Mexico territory. Billy watched these preparations from his cell window, observing the final arrangements for his death with the detached interest of someone who had already begun to separate himself from the world of the living. But Billy the Kid wasn't destined to die on the gallows that had been built for him. The boy who had escaped from jails before would do so one final time, though this escape would prove to be merely a postponement of the fate that had been pursuing him since the day he chose to place himself outside the law. The spring morning of April 28, 1881, dawned quietly over Lincoln, with nothing to suggest that this day would become one of the most famous in the history of the American West. Deputy Sheriff James Bell sat reading a newspaper in the courthouse office while his fellow guard, Deputy Bob Ollinger, had walked across the street to take his midday meal at the hotel. The routine of guarding Billy the Kid had settled into a pattern over the weeks since his conviction, and the two men had grown perhaps too comfortable with their famous prisoner. Billy had been a model prisoner during his time in the Lincoln jail, causing no trouble and even developing friendly relationships with his guards. Bell, in particular, had come to regard the young outlaw with something approaching affection, impressed by Billy's intelligence and apparent acceptance of his fate. The deputy sheriff often lingered in Billy's cell for conversations that ranged far beyond the usual exchanges between captor and prisoner. But Billy had not accepted his fate as completely as his guards believed. During the long hours in his cell, he had carefully studied the courthouse building, noting the habits of his guards and the routines that governed daily life in the jail. He had observed that Ollinger, The more suspicious and careful of his 2 guards usually left the building around noon for his dinner, leaving only the more trusting Bell to watch him. The opportunity Billy had been waiting for came when Bell escorted him to the courthouse privy, a small building in the yard behind the main structure. The walk to and from the privy was one of the few times when Billy was allowed outside his cell, and it required one of his guards to accompany him while leaving his leg irons in place, but removing the handcuffs that normally secured his wrists. The exact details of what happened next would be debated for decades afterward, with different witnesses offering conflicting accounts of how Billy managed to overpower Bell and obtain a weapon. What seems certain is that Billy somehow got hold of Bell's revolver during their return from the privy, perhaps by striking the deputy with his leg irons or by wresting the gun away during a moment when Bell's attention was distracted. The shooting of James Bell was quick and final, ending the life of a man who had treated Billy with kindness and respect during his weeks of imprisonment. Billy would later express regret for Bell's death, describing it as a necessary evil that he had not wanted to commit, but that circumstances had forced upon him. The deputy sheriff died in the courthouse hallway, shot by a man he had considered more friend than prisoner. Bob Ollinger heard the gunshot from across the street and began running toward the courthouse, probably expecting to find that Billy had attempted an escape and been shot by Bell. Instead, he found himself looking up at the second-floor window, where Billy stood holding a shotgun that had been taken from the jail's weapons rack. The confrontation between the 2 men was brief, with Billy firing both barrels of the shotgun and killing Ollinger instantly. The escape itself was almost anticlimactic after the drama of the 2 killings. Billy used a pickaxe to break the chain that connected his leg irons, though he was unable to remove the iron cuffs that remained locked around his ankles. He then commandeered a horse from the courthouse stable and rode out of Lincoln in broad daylight, while townspeople watched from windows and doorways, but made no attempt to stop him. The news of Billy's escape spread throughout New Mexico territory with the speed that only shocking events can achieve. Telegraph messages carried word of the breakout to law enforcement agencies throughout the Southwest, while newspapers prepared special editions that would make Billy the Kid famous far beyond the borders of New Mexico. The escape had been dramatic enough to capture the imagination of people who had never heard of the Lincoln County War or the complex events that had created the Outlaw. Billy's freedom after his escape was brief and precarious, marked by the knowledge that every law enforcement officer in the territory would be looking for him, and that his famous face made anonymity impossible. He could no longer rely on the network of sympathizers who had supported him during his earlier years as an outlaw, as many of his former friends had concluded that his cause was hopeless and that helping him would only bring trouble to themselves. The countryside through which Billy rode during his final weeks of freedom was changing in ways that made the life of an outlaw increasingly difficult. The arrival of the railroad had brought new settlers and new forms of communication that made it harder for wanted men to disappear into the vast spaces of the frontier. Telegraph lines connected distant towns, allowing law enforcement agencies to coordinate their efforts in ways that had been impossible just a few years earlier. Billy's movements during the weeks following his escape were erratic and seemingly without purpose, as though he understood that his freedom was temporary, but could not decide how to use the time that remained to him. He visited old friends and former companions, seeking shelter and assistance, but finding that many doors that had once been open to him were now closed. The weight of his situation seemed to press down on Billy with increasing force as the days passed. He was a young man without a future, someone whose choices had narrowed to the point where death seemed the only possible outcome of his story. The boy who had once dreamed of respectability and normal relationships had become a figure trapped by his own legend, unable to escape the role that circumstances and his own actions had created for him. Billy's last letter, written during this period to a friend in Texas, revealed the depth of his despair and his understanding that his time was running out. He wrote about his regret for the violent path his life had taken, and his wish that he could somehow make amends for the pain he had caused to others. The letter was the work of someone who had moved beyond anger and defiance to a kind of resigned sadness about the waste that his life represented. The young man who had escaped from the Lincoln jail was already more ghost than outlaw, a figure whose legend would outlive him by decades, but whose actual existence was drawing to a close with the inevitable certainty of a story that could have only one ending. The freedom he had gained through violence would prove to be merely the final chapter in a life that had been shaped by forces beyond his control and choices that had seemed necessary at the time, but that had ultimately led him to a place from which there was no escape. Pat Garrett's pursuit of Billy the Kid after the Lincoln jailbreak was marked by the methodical patience of a hunter who understood his quarry and the terrain where the final confrontation would occur. The sheriff had spent months studying Billy's habits and relationships, creating a detailed map of the young outlaw's world that would guide his search through the vast expanses of southeastern New Mexico. The territory through which Garrett tracked his prey was a landscape of stunning beauty and harsh realities, where summer heat could kill a man as surely as a bullet, and where water sources were so precious that their locations were guarded secrets among those who made their living in the desert. It was country that favored the hunted over the hunter, with countless hiding places among the arroyos and mesas that rose from the desert floor like ancient monuments to forgotten civilizations. Garrett's posse consisted of men who knew the country intimately, former cowboys and hunters who could read sign like other men read newspapers, and who understood the subtle indicators that revealed where a man had passed and where he might be going. They rode across landscapes that seemed empty to untrained eyes, but that told detailed stories to those who knew how to interpret the signs written in dust and stone. The manhunt was conducted against the backdrop of a frontier that was rapidly changing, as railroads brought new settlers and new forms of law enforcement to regions that had previously been governed by informal codes of personal honor and mutual respect. The days when a man could disappear into the wilderness and live indefinitely beyond the reach of organized authority were ending, though Billy seemed unaware of or unwilling to accept this new reality. Garrett's strategy was based on his understanding that Billy could not remain completely isolated from human contact for extended periods. The young outlaw would eventually need food, ammunition, and the companionship that his gregarious nature demanded, and these needs would force him to take risks that a more cautious fugitive might have avoided. The sheriff positioned his men at locations where Billy was likely to seek help, then waited with the patience of someone who knew that time was on his side. The New Mexico of 1881 was a territory caught between its violent past and its aspirations for statehood, where men like Garrett represented the forces of civilization, while figures like Billy embodied the lawlessness that territorial officials were determined to eliminate. The manhunt for Billy the Kid became a symbol of this larger struggle, a test of whether organized law enforcement could prevail over the individualistic violence that had characterized the frontier for so long. Billy's movements during the final weeks of his life followed patterns that Garrett had predicted based on his knowledge of the young outlaw's personality and relationships. The fugitive seemed drawn to familiar places and trusted companions, seeking comfort in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile to his continued existence. His choices revealed a man who was emotionally exhausted by years of violence and isolation, someone who was no longer thinking clearly about the practical requirements of survival. The small communities scattered throughout Lincoln County had been forced to choose sides in the conflict between law and outlaw, with most residents concluding that their own safety and prosperity required supporting the forces of order rather than romantic notions about the freedom of the frontier. Billy found that doors which had once been open to him were now closed, and that people who had once welcomed him now viewed his presence as a dangerous liability. Garrett's pursuit was aided by a network of informants who provided information about Billy's movements in exchange for the substantial reward that had been offered for the outlaw's capture. These informants came from all levels of society, from respectable merchants who wanted to see law and order established in their communities, to former outlaws who had decided that cooperation with authorities offered better prospects than continued resistance. The psychological toll of being constantly hunted was evident in the reports that reached Garrett about Billy's behavior during his final weeks of freedom. Former companions described a young man who seemed to have aged years in a matter of months, someone who started at unexpected sounds and who displayed the kind of nervous alertness that came from living under constant threat. The carefree youth who had once charmed dance partners and impressed journalists had been replaced by a haunted figure who understood that his life was measuring itself in days rather than years. Billy's relationship with Pete Maxwell, a prominent rancher whose family controlled vast holdings around Fort Sumner, became crucial to Garrett's investigation. Maxwell had known Billy for years and had sometimes employed him for ranch work during periods when the young outlaw was attempting to live peacefully. But Maxwell was also a respectable businessman who could not afford to be associated with wanted criminals, particularly as territorial authorities increased pressure on those who aided fugitives. The Fort Sumner area held special significance for Billy, representing one of the few places where he had experienced something approaching normal social relationships. The community included a substantial Hispanic population that had historically been sympathetic to those who resisted Anglo authority, and Billy had formed friendships there that transcended the usual divisions between outlaw and citizen. But even these relationships were strained by the reality of his situation and the dangers that his presence brought to anyone who helped him. Garrett's intelligence network eventually provided him with information suggesting that Billy was hiding in the Fort Sumner area, probably staying with friends or sympathizers who lived in the small adobe houses that surrounded the old military post. The sheriff understood that a direct assault on the community would be counterproductive, alienating potential allies and giving Billy the opportunity to escape into the surrounding countryside, where tracking him would be extremely difficult. Instead, Garrett chose to conduct a careful surveillance of the area, positioning his men where they could observe the movements of people entering and leaving Fort Sumner, while remaining hidden from anyone who might warn Billy of their presence. The sheriff was particularly interested in Pete Maxwell's compound, which included not only the main ranch house, but also several smaller buildings where employees and visitors might stay. The waiting game that developed around Fort Sumner tested the patience of both hunter and hunted, with Garrett's men maintaining their surveillance for days without seeing any sign of their quarry. But the sheriff was confident that Billy's need for human contact would eventually force him to make an appearance, and that when he did, the careful preparation would pay off in the form of a successful capture or elimination. The landscape around Fort Sumner seemed to hold its breath during those final days of July 1881, as though the desert itself understood that something significant was about to occur. The summer heat shimmered off the adobe buildings and dusty streets, creating an atmosphere of suspended animation where every shadow might conceal a watcher, and every sound might signal the beginning or end of a chase that had captivated the attention of the entire territory. Billy's fate was approaching with the inexorable certainty of nightfall, carried forward by forces that had been set in motion years earlier, when a fatherless boy had first chosen to place himself outside the law rather than submit to its judgment. The young man who had escaped from the Lincoln jail was about to discover that freedom, like everything else in his life, came with a price that would ultimately prove too high to pay. The night of July 14th, 1881, settled over Fort Sumner with the gentle quiet that marked summer evenings in the high desert, when the day's heat finally began to dissipate and the first stars appeared in the vast New Mexico sky. The old military post had been transformed into a civilian settlement, but it retained the orderly layout that military engineers had imposed on the landscape years earlier, with neat rows of adobe buildings arranged around a central plaza where children played and adults gathered to discuss the small events that marked the passage of time in a remote frontier community. Pete Maxwell's house sat on the edge of this settlement, a substantial adobe structure that spoke to the wealth and influence of a family that had prospered in the cattle business during the territorial period. The house was surrounded by smaller buildings that housed ranch hands and visitors, creating a compound that functioned almost like a small village within the larger community of Fort Sumner. Billy had been staying in one of these smaller buildings for several days, seeking refuge with friends who understood the risks they were taking, but who felt bound by ties of loyalty and affection that transcended the legal considerations that should have governed their actions. The young outlaw had grown increasingly careless about his safety, perhaps because he was emotionally exhausted by months of constant vigilance, or perhaps because he had reached a point where death seemed preferable to the indefinite continuation of his hunted existence. Pat Garrett and his deputies had been watching the Maxwell compound for days, maintaining their surveillance from concealed positions that allowed them to observe the comings and goings of residents and visitors without revealing their own presence. The sheriff had received information suggesting that Billy was in the area, but he had not yet been able to confirm the fugitive's exact location or to find an opportunity to approach him without risking a gunfight that might endanger innocent civilians. The decision to enter Maxwell's house on the night of July 14th was based on Garrett's growing impatience with the surveillance operation and his desire to confront Pete Maxwell directly about Billy's whereabouts. The sheriff understood that Maxwell was in a difficult position, caught between his friendship with Billy and his obligations as a law-abiding citizen, but Garrett believed that direct pressure might produce the information he needed to end the manhunt. Garrett approached Maxwell's house near midnight, accompanied by 2 deputies who remained outside while the sheriff entered through the front door to speak with the rancher in private. The house was dark and quiet, with its occupants apparently asleep after another routine day of ranch work and domestic activities. The sheriff's footsteps echoed softly on the hard-packed earth floor as he made his way toward Maxwell's bedroom, guided by his familiarity with the layout of the building. Pete Maxwell was awakened by Garrett's arrival and sat up in his bed to speak with the sheriff about the situation that had brought armed lawmen to his home. The conversation was conducted in whispers, as both men understood that their discussion might be overheard by others in the house, and that the information being shared could have life or death consequences for the young outlaw who was the subject of their conversation. While Garrett questioned Maxwell, Billy was returning to the compound from a visit to the house of a friend where he had spent the evening in conversation and companionship that had temporarily allowed him to forget the dangers that surrounded his existence. The young outlaw was dressed simply in shirt and trousers, carrying no weapon except for a small knife that he used for cutting meat and other everyday tasks. Billy's approach to Maxwell's house was casual and unhurried, reflecting his belief that he was in a safe place among friends who would warn him of any danger. But his friends were not aware of Garrett's presence in the compound, and the warning that might have saved his life was never given. The young outlaw walked toward his fate with the innocent confidence of someone who didn't know that death was waiting for him in the darkness. The encounter between Billy and Garrett occurred in Maxwell's bedroom, a small space made even smaller by the presence of furniture, and the 3 men who suddenly found themselves facing each other in circumstances that none of them had anticipated. Billy entered the room seeking Pete Maxwell, perhaps hoping to borrow something, or simply to continue a conversation they had begun earlier in the day. The darkness of the room made immediate identification impossible, and Billy's first words were a question directed towards the figure he could barely see sitting on Maxwell's bed. He asked who was there, speaking in Spanish, as was his habit when addressing the Hispanic residents of Fort Sumner, who made up a large portion of his social circle during his stays in the community. Garrett's response was immediate and final, a single shot fired from his revolver that struck Billy in the chest and killed him almost instantly. The young outlaw fell to the floor without firing a shot or even drawing the knife that was his only weapon, ending a life that had been marked by violence, but that concluded without the dramatic gunfight that many people had expected would characterize Billy the Kid's final moments. The shot that killed Billy the Kid echoed through the quiet night air of Fort Sumner, bringing people running from throughout the compound to discover what had happened in Pete Maxwell's bedroom. They found the body of the young outlaw lying on the floor, his life ended at the age of 21, by a bullet that had traveled no more than a few feet, but that had crossed the vast distance between legend and reality. Garrett emerged from the house to face the crowd that had gathered outside, announcing that Billy the Kid was dead and that the manhunt that had captivated the territory for months was finally over. The sheriff's words were met with a mixture of relief and sadness as people struggled to process the news that one of the most famous figures in New Mexico had been killed in such an ordinary setting and in such an undramatic fashion. The women of Fort Sumner, many of whom had known Billy personally and had danced with him at community gatherings, wept openly for the young man who had died so far from his birthplace and so alone, despite being surrounded by people who cared about him. Their grief was genuine and immediate, the natural response of a close-knit community that had lost one of its own to the violent forces that shaped frontier life. Billy's body was prepared for burial by the same women who mourned his death, their hands performing the ancient rituals of washing and dressing that marked the transition from life to death in communities where such ceremonies were still personal rather than professional obligations. They dressed him in simple clothes and arranged his body with the care that they would have shown to any member of their families. The funeral was held the next day in the small cemetery outside Fort Sumner, where wooden crosses marked the graves of others who had died far from their places of birth and who had found their final rest in the high desert soil of New Mexico. The service was simple and brief, conducted in both English and Spanish to honor the bilingual nature of the community that was saying goodbye to the young outlaw. Pete Maxwell, despite the circumstances that had brought violence to his home, provided a wooden coffin for Billy's burial and helped to carry the body to its final resting place. The gesture spoke to the complex relationships that characterized frontier communities, where personal loyalty often transcended legal considerations and where men could be both friend and enemy, depending on the circumstances that brought them together. The grave was marked with a simple wooden headboard that bore Billy's name and the dates of his brief life, a modest memorial for someone whose story would be told and retold for generations after his death. The inscription was carved by hand, probably by one of the Mexican craftsmen who lived in Fort Sumner and who possessed the skills necessary to transform raw wood into a lasting monument. As the small group of mourners dispersed from the cemetery, returning to their homes and their daily routines, the immediate drama of Billy the Kid's life came to an end. But his story was just beginning its transformation from historical fact into American legend, a process that would reshape and reimagine his brief existence until it bore little resemblance to the reality of the young man who lay beneath the New Mexico soil. The news of Billy's death spread throughout the territory and beyond with the speed that telegraph wires and newspaper printing presses made possible in the 1880s. Within days, accounts of the shooting appeared in papers from Denver to New York, each version adding new details and interpretations that would contribute to the growing mythology surrounding the young outlaw's life and death. Some of these accounts portrayed Billy as a vicious killer who had finally received the justice he deserved, while others depicted him as a tragic figure whose death marked the end of an era when individual courage could still challenge organized authority. The truth, as usual, was more complex than either interpretation suggested, but complexity rarely survived the process by which historical events became popular entertainment. Garrett's account of the shooting was detailed and precise, the report of a professional lawman who understood that his actions would be scrutinized by both supporters and critics of his methods. The sheriff described the encounter as a chance meeting that had resulted in Billy's death when the outlaw reached for what Garrett believed was a weapon, though no gun was found on Billy's body after the shooting. The absence of a weapon raised questions about the circumstances of Billy's death that would be debated for decades afterward, with some critics suggesting that Garrett had murdered an unarmed man, while others defended the sheriff's actions as necessary and justified, given Billy's reputation and history of violence. The truth of what happened in Pete Maxwell's bedroom that night died with Billy, leaving only conflicting testimony and the inevitable speculation that surrounds controversial events. But for the moment, in the quiet hours after the funeral, Fort Sumner settled back into the rhythms of daily life that had been briefly disrupted by the dramatic conclusion to Billy the Kid's story. Children played in the dusty streets, women tended their gardens and livestock, and men went about the business of earning a living in a harsh but beautiful land that demanded constant effort from those who chose to make it their home. The grave in the Fort Sumner Cemetery became a destination for the curious visitors who began arriving within weeks of Billy's death, drawn by the growing legend that was already beginning to obscure the historical reality of the young outlaw's life. These pilgrims came seeking some connection to the story that newspapers and dime novels had made famous, but they found only a simple wooden marker in a desert cemetery that revealed nothing about the complex forces that had shaped one brief life. The wooden headboard that marked Billy's grave would eventually be replaced by more substantial monuments as his legend grew, but the simple original marker captured something essential about the man who lay beneath it. Billy the Kid had been, at the end, just another young man who had died far from home and been buried by friends who cared more about his humanity than his reputation. The morning sun that rose over Fort Sumner on July the 15th, 1881, illuminated a world that had been subtly but permanently changed by the events of the previous night. Billy the Kid was dead, But the story of his life was just beginning its transformation into something larger and more enduring than the brief existence of the young man who lay in the town's small cemetery. Within hours of the shooting, telegraph messages were carrying news of Billy's death to newspaper offices throughout the American West and beyond. Editors who had followed the Lincoln County War and its aftermath recognized immediately that they had a story that would captivate readers from coast to coast, and they began preparing special editions that would satisfy the public's appetite for details about the famous outlaw's final moments. The newspaper accounts that appeared in the days following Billy's death were often inaccurate and always sensationalized, written by journalists who were more interested in creating dramatic narratives than in preserving historical truth. These stories portrayed Billy alternately as a cold-blooded killer who had finally met his match and as a romantic figure whose death marked the end of the frontier's golden age of individual freedom. But even as newspapers struggled to make sense of Billy's life and death, other forces were at work transforming his story into the kind of legend that would outlive all the participants in the actual events. Dime novelists, always alert to popular interest in frontier heroes and villains, began producing fictional accounts of Billy's adventures that bore little resemblance to historical reality, but that satisfied readers' desire for exciting entertainment. The songs about Billy the Kid that had begun circulating during his lifetime grew more numerous and more elaborate after his death, as ballad makers throughout the Southwest added new verses and new interpretations to the musical tradition that was preserving his memory in the collective consciousness of the frontier. These songs were performed around campfires and in saloons, carrying Billy's story to audiences who would never read a newspaper or visit New Mexico, but who would remember the melodies and words that celebrated or condemned the young outlaw. Pat Garrett found himself in the uncomfortable position of being forever linked to the man he had killed, his own reputation dependent on the continued fame of his most famous victim. The sheriff would spend the rest of his life answering questions about the night at Fort Sumner, defending his actions against critics who suggested that he had murdered an unarmed man, while basking in the praise of those who saw him as a hero who had rid the territory of a dangerous criminal. Garrett's own book about his pursuit and killing of Billy the Kid, published in 1882, became one of the earliest attempts to provide an authoritative account of the outlaw's life and death. But even this supposedly factual narrative was shaped by Garrett's need to justify his actions and by the publisher's desire to create a commercially successful book that would appeal to readers who wanted exciting stories rather than careful history. The grave in Fort Sumner became a place of pilgrimage for those who were drawn by Billy's growing legend, though the simple wooden marker that identified his resting place was often stolen by souvenir hunters who wanted to possess some tangible connection to the famous outlaw. The theft and replacement of grave markers became a regular occurrence, reflecting the public's insatiable appetite for relics associated with frontier heroes and outlaws. Local residents of Fort Sumner found themselves in the position of unofficial guardians of Billy's memory, answering questions from visitors and providing information about the young outlaw's time in their community. Many of these residents had known Billy personally, and their recollections provided a more balanced and human perspective on his character than the sensationalized accounts that appeared in popular publications. The women who had danced with Billy at community gatherings remembered him as charming and courteous, someone who treated them with respect and who seemed to genuinely enjoy their company despite his dangerous reputation. These memories contradicted the image of a cold-blooded killer that had been created by some newspaper accounts, revealing instead a young man who was capable of normal social relationships when circumstances permitted. Former ranch hands who had worked alongside Billy recalled his skill with horses and cattle, his willingness to do his share of difficult and dangerous work, and his ability to get along with men from very different backgrounds. These professional assessments suggested that Billy possessed the practical skills and personal qualities that could have made him successful in legitimate occupations if his circumstances had been different. But the most persistent memories of those who had known Billy personally centered on his intelligence and his love of reading, qualities that had distinguished him from many of his contemporaries and that had impressed adults who encountered him during his various attempts to live peacefully within the law. The image of Billy the Kid as an educated young man who wrote thoughtful letters and engaged in serious conversations about literature and politics was difficult to reconcile with his reputation as a savage killer. The transformation of Billy's story from historical fact into popular legend accelerated during the 1880s and 1890s as the American frontier began to disappear and as the nation looked back nostalgically on an era that was already being romanticized in literature and popular entertainment. Billy became a symbol of the individual freedom and personal courage that Americans believed had characterized the frontier period, even though his actual life had been marked more by tragedy than by triumph. The dime novels that featured Billy the Kid as their protagonist created increasingly elaborate and fantastic adventures for the young outlaw, transforming him into a figure who could single-handedly defeat entire posses of lawmen or rescue innocent settlers from bands of savage Indians. These fictional accounts bore no resemblance to the historical Billy, but they satisfied readers' desire for heroes who embodied the virtues that Americans associated with their frontier heritage. Wild West shows, which became popular forms of entertainment in the late 19th century, sometimes featured performers who claimed to have known Billy the Kid or who portrayed events from his life in dramatic reenactments. These theatrical presentations further distorted the historical record while helping to establish Billy's place in the mythology of the American West. The question of whether Billy the Kid had actually died at Fort Sumner became the subject of persistent speculation and occasional claims by elderly men who insisted that they were the famous outlaw and that reports of his death had been greatly exaggerated. These claims were never substantiated, but they reflected the public's reluctance to accept that such a legendary figure could have died in such ordinary circumstances. Academic historians who began studying the Lincoln County War and its participants in the early 20th century found that separating fact from fiction in Billy's story required careful examination of contemporary documents and testimony from credible witnesses who had actually known the young outlaw. Their work revealed a more complex and human figure than the legendary Billy the Kid, but their scholarly accounts reached much smaller audiences than the popular entertainments that continued to shape public perception of his life. The New Mexico of the early 20th century was a very different place from the frontier territory where Billy had lived and died, but his grave in Fort Sumner remained a popular destination for tourists who wanted to connect with the romantic past that his story represented. The state's tourism industry recognized the commercial value of Billy's legend and began promoting visits to sites associated with his life as part of the broader effort to attract visitors to the Southwest. Museums and historical societies throughout New Mexico collected artifacts and documents related to Billy's life, though many of these items were of questionable authenticity given the public's willingness to pay high prices for anything that could be connected to the famous outlaw. The line between genuine historical artifacts and clever forgeries became increasingly blurred as Billy's commercial value continued to grow decades after his death. The centennial of Billy's birth in 1959 prompted renewed interest in his story and new efforts to separate historical fact from popular mythology. Scholars and journalists who examined the available evidence concluded that the real Billy the Kid had been a more sympathetic figure than his reputation suggested, a young man whose violent career had been shaped by circumstances beyond his control rather than by an inherent tendency toward criminality. But by this time, Billy's transformation into a figure of American mythology was so complete that historical accuracy seemed almost irrelevant to his continued popularity. He had become a symbol rather than a person, a representation of values and conflicts that transcended the specific events of his brief life. The boy from New York who had died in New Mexico at the age of 21 had achieved a kind of immortality that few historical figures ever attain. The grave in Fort Sumner continued to attract visitors throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, though the simple wooden marker of 1881 had long since been replaced by more elaborate monuments designed to withstand both the harsh desert climate and the attention of souvenir hunters. The cemetery itself became a small museum dedicated to preserving the memory of Billy and others who had shaped the history of the frontier period. On quiet evenings in Fort Sumner, when the desert wind stirred the dust around the old cemetery and the stars appeared in the vast New Mexico sky, it was possible to imagine the young man who lay beneath the weathered stone as he had actually been, rather than as legend had made him. Billy the Kid had been, in the end, a boy who had lost his way in a harsh world and who had paid the ultimate price for choices that had seemed necessary at the time, but that had ultimately led him to a lonely death far from home. The story of Billy the Kid reminds us that legends are often more powerful than the facts that inspire them, and that the American West continues to capture our imagination not because of what it actually was, but because of what we believe it represented. In that sense, Billy's transformation from person to symbol was both inevitable and necessary, a process that allowed his brief life to speak to the dreams and fears of generations who never knew the frontier, but who found in his story something that spoke to their own struggles with questions of justice, freedom, and the price of standing apart from society. The wind that blows across the high desert of New Mexico carries with it the voices of all those who lived and died in that harsh but beautiful land. But among those voices, the story of Billy the Kid continues to whisper of a time when the American West was still young, and when a boy from New York could become a legend that would outlive the civilization that created and ultimately destroyed him. In the end, perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it is all any of us can hope for, to be remembered not as we were, but as we dreamed we might become, in a world where such dreams still seemed possible, and where the horizon always promised something better just beyond the next ridge.